The rattling death knell of fever echoed through Thomas Crawford's cabin as he clutched his wife's hand, watching helplessly as her life slipped away in the harsh Colorado winter of 1878. Elizabeth Crawford, once vibrant and full of laughter, had been reduced to a hollow shell of herself, her golden hair matted with sweat, her blue eyes glazed with delirium. The mountain doctor had tried everything: willow bark tea, cold compresses, even the last of Thomas's whiskey to break the fever, but the influenza that had swept through Pinecrest Valley had claimed its most precious victim yet. "Promise me," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside their small homestead. "Promise me you'll write to Beatrice. She'll come. She always said she would if." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. At 32, he'd faced outlaws, survived a Comanche raid, and endured 3 years of drought, but nothing had prepared him for the devastation of losing his beloved wife of 8 years. "I promise, Lizzie," he choked out, pressing her fingers to his lips. "I'll write to your sister." Elizabeth's final breath came quietly, like the soft settling of snow on the windowsill. Thomas sat motionless for hours, still holding her hand as it grew cold. Outside, the livestock needed tending, the fire needed stoking, but the big cowboy couldn't move. His world had collapsed around him, leaving nothing but the empty shell of the cabin they'd built together. The funeral was small but dignified. All 23 residents of Pinecrest attended, standing somber-faced in the bitter January cold as the preacher spoke words that Thomas barely heard. He nodded mechanically when people offered condolences, accepted covered dishes he would never eat, and returned to his empty cabin to write the hardest letter of his life. "Dear Miss Beatrice Hammond, it is with profound sorrow that I must inform you of the passing of your sister, Elizabeth. Influenza took her from us 3 days past. In her final moments, she asked that I write to you." Thomas paused, his large hand trembling as he dipped the pen again. What could he possibly say that he had failed to protect her? That the remote mountain life he'd promised would be so full of adventure had ultimately killed her. He finished the letter with practical details: the date of her passing, the location of their homestead should Beatrice wish to visit Elizabeth's grave, and sealed it without rereading the words. The letter would take weeks to reach Boston, where Elizabeth had often told him Beatrice taught at a ladies' finishing school. Thomas had never met his sister-in-law, though Elizabeth spoke of her often: the younger sister who had raised her after their parents' death, who had sacrificed her own opportunities, so Elizabeth could marry and move west with the man she loved. Winter gave way to spring, and Thomas moved through his days like a ghost. He tended the livestock, repaired fences, and nodded grimly at neighbors who still looked at him with pity. At night, he would sit on the porch, staring at the stars Elizabeth had loved, drinking just enough whiskey to numb the pain, but never enough to forget his responsibilities. It was early May when the stagecoach arrived in Pinecrest, an unusual occurrence since the regular route only came through every other month. Thomas was in town purchasing supplies when he noticed the commotion at the general store. "Crawford," called Samuel Wilson, the storekeeper. "There's someone here asking after you." Thomas turned, his heart catching in his throat at the sight of the woman standing on the porch of the general store. For one impossible moment, he thought Elizabeth had somehow returned to him: the same honey-blonde hair, similar delicate features, but as he drew closer, the differences became apparent. This woman was slightly taller, her posture more rigid, her eyes a deeper blue than Elizabeth's cornflower gaze. She wore a simple traveling dress of navy blue, practical yet unmistakably Eastern in its cut and quality. "Mr. Crawford," she asked, her voice crisp but hesitant. "I'm Beatrice Hammond, Elizabeth's sister." Thomas removed his hat, suddenly aware of his unkempt appearance, the beard he'd neglected to trim, the shirt that had seen better days. "Miss Hammond, I wasn't expecting you." "I received your letter," she said simply, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I've come to pay my respects to my sister, and—" She hesitated, glancing around at the curious onlookers. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" Thomas nodded, helping the stagecoach driver unload her trunk and carpet bag. My wagon's just over yonder. It's about 5 miles to the homestead. The ride back was awkward, filled with the kind of silence that stretches between strangers bound by shared loss. Thomas stole glances at Beatrice, noting how she sat straight-backed despite the jostling of the wagon, how her gloved hands remained folded neatly in her lap. Elizabeth wrote to me often about this place, Beatrice finally said as they crested a hill, revealing the sprawling valley below. She said the wildflowers in spring were worth every hardship of winter. Thomas's throat tightened. They were her favorite, valleys full of them now. Beatrice nodded, and Thomas caught the glimmer of tears. She quickly blinked away. This woman, this proper Eastern lady, suddenly seemed far more real to him. She loved it here, he offered quietly. Even when things were hard, she never complained. That sounds like Lizzie, Beatrice replied, a sad smile touching her lips. She always found beauty everywhere. As they approached the homestead, Thomas felt a flush of pride mixed with shame. The cabin was solid and well built, with a new addition he'd completed just last summer to give Elizabeth the larger kitchen she'd wanted. But the flower beds she'd tended so lovingly were overgrown with weeds, and the curtains she'd sewn hung limp and dusty in the windows. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he helped Beatrice down from the wagon, "but it's home." "It's exactly as she described," Beatrice replied, her eyes taking in every detail. "She was very proud of what you built together." Inside, Thomas was painfully aware of the bachelor state to which the cabin had descended. He'd kept it functional but little more. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, clothes were draped over chairs, and Elizabeth's collection of pressed wildflowers was gathering dust on the mantel. "I'll put your things in the spare room," Thomas said hastily, grabbing her trunk. "It's not much, but there's a bed and Mr. Crawford," Beatrice interrupted gently. "Please don't trouble yourself on my account. I understand what grief can do to a household." There was something in her voice, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere words that made Thomas pause. "You're very kind, Miss Hammond, more than I deserve." Beatrice removed her gloves and hat, setting them aside with deliberate care. "I'm not here to judge Mr. Crawford. I'm here because Elizabeth was the only family I had left, and because—" She hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She asked me to come should anything happen to her." Thomas frowned. "In her letters to you?" "Yes," Beatrice nodded. "She worried about this place being too remote, about what would happen if exactly what did happen happened." She took a deep breath. "She asked me to promise that I would come and help should she." Her voice faltered. "She never told me that," Thomas said softly. "She wouldn't have wanted to worry you," Beatrice replied, her gaze direct. "But I promised her, and I keep my promises, Mr. Crawford." "Thomas," he corrected automatically. "Please call me Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, and he was struck by how differently his name sounded in her voice compared to Elizabeth's. "I've taken a leave of absence from the school where I teach. I can stay for 3 months to help put things in order, to visit Lizzie's grave, and to—" She gestured vaguely around the cabin, "to ensure that you're managing." Thomas should have been offended by the implication that he needed managing, but instead he felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. For months, he'd been drowning in grief and responsibility, and now this woman, this stranger who was also somehow familiar, was offering him a lifeline. "I'd be grateful for the help, Miss Hammond," he said sincerely, "and I think Elizabeth would be too." Beatrice's smile was small but genuine. "Then it's settled, and please call me Beatrice." That first evening established a pattern that would continue in the weeks to come. Beatrice, once shown around the cabin, immediately set to work bringing order to the chaos. She didn't criticize or comment on the state of things. She simply rolled up her sleeves, quite literally, Thomas noted with surprise, and began sorting, cleaning, and organizing. Thomas, uncertain of his role with this new presence in his home, retreated to the barn to tend to the livestock and complete the endless chores that kept the homestead functioning. When he returned for supper, he was astonished to find the table set properly, the cabin smelling of fresh bread, and a stew bubbling on the stove that made his stomach growl in a way it hadn't in months. "You didn't have to cook," he said awkwardly, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I enjoy cooking," Beatrice replied simply. "Elizabeth wrote that you're partial to venison stew. I found some in your smokehouse." Thomas swallowed hard. The venison had been from his last hunt with Elizabeth. She'd helped him track the buck and had insisted on learning to smoke the meat herself. He hadn't been able to touch it since her passing. "That's thoughtful of you," he managed. They ate in relative silence, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Thomas found himself stealing glances at Beatrice, noting the differences between her and Elizabeth. Where his wife had been soft and warm, Beatrice was contained and precise. Her movements were economical, her posture perfect even at the rough-hewn table. Yet there were moments, a certain tilt of her head, the way she absently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that were so reminiscent of Elizabeth that it made his heart ache. "Would you show me her grave tomorrow?" Beatrice asked suddenly, setting down her spoon. Thomas nodded. "Of course, it's not far, just up on that rise to the east. She always said it had the best view of the valley." "She would have appreciated that," Beatrice said softly. Then, changing the subject, "I noticed your vegetable garden needs attention. Elizabeth wrote that you grow most of your own food." "We did," Thomas confirmed. "I haven't had the heart to plant much this spring." "Then we'll start there tomorrow after visiting Lizzie," Beatrice said decisively. "It's not too late to get a good summer crop in." Thomas wanted to protest, to explain that he couldn't bear to do the tasks he'd always done with Elizabeth, but something in Beatrice's steady gaze stopped him. This wasn't sentimentality, it was practicality. If they didn't plant now, there would be no food for winter. Elizabeth would have been the first to say so. "All right," he agreed. "We'll plant tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect late spring day in the mountains. Thomas led Beatrice up the gentle slope to where a simple wooden cross marked Elizabeth's grave. He'd chosen the spot carefully, a small clearing among aspen trees, overlooking the valley and the cabin below. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom all around, painting the hillside in splashes of blue, yellow, and purple. Thomas hung back as Beatrice approached the grave. She knelt beside it, removed a small book from her pocket, and began to read aloud in a clear, steady voice. It took Thomas a moment to recognize the poem one Elizabeth had often recited, about death being merely a doorway to another room. The words, in Beatrice's voice, brought fresh tears to his eyes. When she finished reading, Beatrice remained kneeling for several minutes, her head bowed. Thomas turned away, giving her privacy for her grief. When she finally rose and rejoined him, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "She loved poetry," Beatrice said simply. "Our mother taught us both to recite verse before we could properly read." She would recite poems while she worked, Thomas remembered, said it made the time pass quicker. Beatrice nodded. She was always the one finding ways to make difficult things bearable. She looked back at the grave, then straightened her shoulders. "She would want us to get on with things, wouldn't she?" "She would," Thomas agreed, finding comfort in this shared understanding of the woman they had both loved in different ways. They spent the rest of the day preparing and planting the vegetable garden. Thomas was surprised to discover that, despite her refined appearance, Beatrice was no stranger to physical labor. She worked methodically, digging furrows and planting seeds with practiced efficiency. "Elizabeth wrote that you were a schoolteacher," Thomas remarked as they worked side by side. "I didn't expect you to know farming," Beatrice smiled faintly. "Before I taught at the finishing school, I worked at a rural school in Vermont. Many of my students were farm children. I learned alongside them in their family gardens so I could better understand their lives." She paused, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Besides, Elizabeth and I grew up on a small farm outside Boston until our parents died. I've always kept a kitchen garden, even in the city." Thomas nodded, impressed despite himself. "Elizabeth never mentioned that. She was very young when we lost our parents," Beatrice explained. "I was 12, she was only 7. She probably didn't remember much of the farm life." As the days passed, Thomas and Beatrice fell into an unexpected rhythm. During the day, they worked separately but with common purpose, Thomas tending to the livestock and repairing the fences and outbuildings that had suffered from neglect during his months of grief, while Beatrice brought the household back to order and maintained the garden. In the evenings, they would share a meal and, increasingly, conversation. Thomas learned that Beatrice was 28, 4 years younger than Elizabeth would have been. She had never married, devoting herself instead to her teaching career and to supporting Elizabeth after their parents' death. She was well-read and had opinions on everything from politics to literature, though she expressed them with a restraint that made it clear she was accustomed to keeping her thoughts to herself. For her part, Beatrice gradually drew Thomas out of his shell, encouraging him to speak of Elizabeth not just in terms of her death, but of their life together. She listened attentively as he recounted their journey west, the challenges of building the homestead, and the dreams they'd shared for its future. "She wrote to me about the apple orchard you plan to plant," Beatrice mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "We had the saplings ordered. They arrived 2 weeks after she died." "I couldn't." He shook his head. "They're still in the root cellar, wrapped in burlap, probably dead by now." "Perhaps not," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "Saplings can be remarkably resilient if properly stored. We could check them tomorrow." To Thomas's astonishment, 5 of the 10 apple saplings had survived, their roots still moist and shoots showing green when he unwrapped them. Under Beatrice's direction, they planted them in the spot Elizabeth had chosen, a sunny slope not far from the cabin. "She'll never see them bear fruit," Thomas said heavily as they tamped soil around the last sapling. "No," Beatrice agreed quietly, "but someone will." She looked at him directly. "Life continues, Thomas." Elizabeth understood that better than most. As May turned to June, the rhythms of the homestead began to feel almost normal again. The vegetable garden flourished under Beatrice's care, the newly planted apple saplings took root, and Thomas found himself awakening each morning with purpose rather than dread. The presence of Elizabeth's sister was both a constant reminder of his loss and, paradoxically, a balm for it. Beatrice, too, seemed to be settling in. The rigid posture and formal manners that had marked her arrival gradually softened. She began to wear simpler dresses, often with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back with a ribbon rather than pinned in its formal style. Thomas caught her humming sometimes as she worked the same folk tunes Elizabeth had loved, and occasionally even laughing at the antics of the barn cats or the stubborn old rooster that ruled the henhouse. It was Beatrice who suggested they attend the midsummer social in Pinecrest, reasoning that Thomas had been isolated for too long. He resisted initially, unable to imagine engaging in festivities when Elizabeth was gone, but Beatrice was gently insistent. "The community has been kind to you," she reminded him, "and Elizabeth would want you to maintain those connections." So it was that Thomas found himself driving the wagon into town on a warm June evening, with Beatrice beside him in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. He was acutely aware of how the situation might appear to others, a widower bringing his late wife's sister to a social gathering barely 5 months after his wife's death. But Beatrice's calm presence somehow made it easier to face the inevitable whispers. The social was held in the newly built schoolhouse, decorated with wildflowers and lit with lanterns. Most of Pinecrest's residents were in attendance, along with folks from neighboring homesteads. Thomas braced himself for awkwardness, but to his surprise, people seemed genuinely pleased to see him emerging from his isolation. Several of the women immediately drew Beatrice into conversation, while the men clapped Thomas on the shoulder and offered quiet words of approval for his return to community life. "You've got yourself a good helper there," observed Jacob Miller, whose farm bordered Thomas's property. "Miss Hammond's got quite a way with those vegetables of yours. Saw them when I rode past last week. Finest-looking garden in the county." "She's been a godsend," Thomas admitted, watching as Beatrice chatted with the miller's wife across the room. "Don't know what I'd have done without her help these past weeks." Jacob gave him a shrewd look. She planning to stay on? The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd been so focused on the day-to-day that he hadn't allowed himself to think about Beatrice's eventual departure. She took a 3-month leave from her teaching position, he said slowly. She's due to return to Boston in August. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. Shame, seems to me she fits in here just fine. Before Thomas could respond, the fiddler struck up a lively tune and people began clearing space for dancing. Thomas retreated to the edge of the room, content to observe, but after several dances he was surprised to see Beatrice approaching him, her cheeks flushed from exertion. Mrs. Miller tells me you're quite the dancer, she said, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. She says Elizabeth always boasted that you never missed a chance to show off your footwork. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. Elizabeth exaggerated my abilities, he demurred. Well, I've just promised the next dance to Mr. Wilson's son, but perhaps after that, you might prove whether my sister was exaggerating or not. Beatrice's tone was light, but Thomas detected something else beneath it, a gentle challenge, perhaps, or an invitation to step further out of his grief. Before he could formulate a response, Beatrice was swept away by young Wilson, leaving Thomas to ponder this new development. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself any pleasure that the very idea of dancing felt almost like a betrayal. Yet as he watched Beatrice move gracefully through the figures of the dance, he found himself remembering Elizabeth's love of such gatherings, how she would insist they attend every social event within riding distance. When the dance ended and Beatrice returned to his side, slightly breathless and smiling, Thomas made his decision. I believe you requested proof of my dancing skills, Miss Hammond, he said, offering his arm with a formality that made her laugh. Indeed I did, Mr. Crawford, she replied, taking his arm. The fiddles struck up a waltz, a slower, more intimate dance than the reels and square dances that had preceded it. Thomas hesitated for just a moment before placing his hand properly at Beatrice's waist. It had been so long since he'd touched a woman, even in such a formal, appropriate way, that the contact felt startlingly intimate. Beatrice must have sensed his discomfort, for she met his eyes with a steady gaze. It's just a dance, Thomas, she said quietly. We're honoring life, not disrespecting death. Her words freed something in him, and as they began to move together, Thomas found himself remembering the joy that had once been so much a part of his life with Elizabeth. Beatrice was a different partner, more precise in her movements, less exuberant, but there was a grace to her that made leading her through the waltz surprisingly pleasant. As the music swelled, Thomas became aware of approving glances from the townspeople around them. Mrs. Wilson nodded approvingly, and even the preacher's wife offered a small smile of encouragement. These people had watched him struggle through the darkest months of his life. Now they were witnessing his first tentative steps back toward living it. The dance ended too soon, and Thomas reluctantly released Beatrice's waist. Thank you, he said simply. The pleasure was mine, she replied, and the genuine warmth in her smile stirred something in Thomas that he had thought long buried with Elizabeth. The ride home was companionable, with Beatrice recounting conversations she'd had with various townspeople, and Thomas pointing out constellations in the clear night sky. It was the most normal Thomas had felt since Elizabeth's death, just a man and a woman enjoying a pleasant evening after a social gathering. Yet as they neared the homestead, Thomas found himself troubled by Jacob Miller's question. Beatrice would be leaving in August. The thought sent an unexpected pang through him. In just a few weeks, she had become an essential part of the homestead and, he had to admit, of his life. What would happen when she returned to Boston? How would he manage the garden she'd planted, the household she'd restored to order, the daily rhythms she'd re-established? You're very quiet, Beatrice observed as they approached the cabin. Just thinking, Thomas replied, helping her down from the wagon. Jacob Miller asked how long you'll be staying. Ah, Beatrice said, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. I suppose that is a practical question. My leave from the school ends in mid-August. Thomas nodded, busying himself with unhitching the horses to avoid meeting her gaze. The place will seem awfully quiet when you go." Beatrice was silent for a long moment. "I've grown quite fond of it here," she finally said, "more than I expected to." There was something in her voice that made Thomas look up. She was standing in the moonlight, her face tilted toward the cabin with an expression of genuine affection. "It suits you," he said without thinking, "more than I would have expected." She turned to him with a small smile. "Elizabeth always said I was too formal, too rigid for frontier life. I think she would be surprised to see how comfortable I've become here." "I think she'd be pleased," Thomas said honestly. "She always wanted you to visit, said you worked too hard and needed mountain air to cure your city pallor." Beatrice laughed, a full, unrestrained sound that Thomas realized he had rarely heard from her. "That sounds like Lizzie, always trying to get me to live a little," as she put it. They walked toward the cabin together, and Thomas was acutely aware of the comfortable silence between them, of how natural it felt to have Beatrice beside him under the vast canopy of stars. It was a dangerous feeling, one that brought equal measures of comfort and guilt. The following weeks brought changes to the homestead and to the tentative friendship between Thomas and Beatrice. As June gave way to July, the vegetable garden flourished, providing more produce than the two of them could possibly eat. Beatrice suggested they preserve the excess, and soon the cabin was filled with the sweet, sour smell of pickling and the fruity steam of jam making. Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to the domestic scenes he would discover upon returning from his work in the fields or with the livestock. Beatrice with flour on her cheek, kneading bread dough. Beatrice on her knees in the garden, her hat askew as she harvested beans. Beatrice sitting on the porch in the evening light, mending one of his shirts with the same precise stitches Elizabeth had always used. These images brought a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the care she took with his home, guilt at the pleasure he found in her company, and an increasing dread of the day she would leave it all behind. He began to look for reasons to be in her presence, offering to help with tasks he would normally have left to her, suggesting evening walks to check on the apple saplings or to collect wild berries that grew on the hillside. For her part, Beatrice seemed to be shedding more of her Eastern reserve with each passing day. She laughed more freely, spoke more openly of her thoughts and feelings, and even adopted some of the practical frontier habits she had initially viewed with skepticism. Thomas caught her drinking coffee directly from the pot one morning when she thought he wasn't looking, and the sheepish grin she gave him when discovered was so charming he couldn't help but laugh. Elizabeth would never believe it, he teased. Her proper sister drinking Cowboy coffee straight from the pot. "Elizabeth knew me better than you think," Beatrice retorted with a spark in her eye. "Who do you think taught me to ride astride rather than side saddle when no one was looking?" This casual mention of Elizabeth no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Thomas found comfort in these shared memories, in the knowledge that through Beatrice, Elizabeth's spirit somehow remained present in their daily lives. It was during one of their evening walks, as they checked on the progress of the apple saplings, that the delicate balance between them first shifted. They had been discussing the possibility of expanding the orchard the following year when a summer thunderstorm blew in with unexpected ferocity. Within moments they were drenched, laughing as they ran for the shelter of the cabin. Inside, dripping on the wooden floor, Beatrice's composure finally broke completely. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, her wet hair hanging in golden ropes around her shoulders, her dress clinging to her in a way that made Thomas suddenly, uncomfortably aware of her as a woman rather than simply as Elizabeth's sister. "Your face when that first raindrop hit." She gasped between peals of laughter. "I've never seen anyone look so personally offended by weather." Thomas couldn't help but join in her mirth, even as he tried to avert his eyes from the outline of her figure beneath the sodden fabric. "It was the principle of the thing," he protested, running a hand through his wet hair. "That cloud deliberately waited until we were at the farthest point from shelter." Beatrice's laughter subsided into hiccups, and she wiped her eyes. "We should change before we catch cold," she said practically, though her eyes still danced with amusement. I'll stoke the fire while you fetch some towels. Thomas nodded, grateful for the chance to compose himself. When he returned with towels, Beatrice had indeed built up the fire and was standing before it, attempting to wring water from her skirts. The firelight caught in her wet hair, turning it to liquid gold, and Thomas was struck by how beautiful she was not in the soft, sunny way Elizabeth had been beautiful, but with a different kind of loveliness, one of strength and clarity. He must have made some sound, for she turned, catching him watching her. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the changing nature of their relationship. For a long moment neither spoke. "Here," Thomas finally said, offering her a towel, "you're shivering." Beatrice accepted it with a murmured thanks, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The contact, slight as it was, sent an unexpected jolt through Thomas, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd experienced even such casual touch. I should change," he said awkwardly, retreating to his bedroom. When he emerged in dry clothes, Beatrice had also changed and was preparing a pot of tea. She had braided her damp hair, and the simple, domestic image she presented made Thomas's heart ache with a confusing mixture of longing and guilt. "I thought tea might warm us up," she said, her voice carefully normal, as if the charged moment by the fire had never happened. "Thank you," Thomas replied, equally careful. "That sounds perfect." They sipped their tea in relative silence, each seemingly lost in thought. It was Beatrice who finally broke the quiet, her voice soft but determined. "Thomas, I think we need to discuss my departure." "It's less than a month away now." Thomas nodded, his chest tight. "Of course, you'll need transportation to Denver to catch the eastbound train." "Yes, but that's not what I meant." Beatrice set down her cup and looked at him directly. "We need to ensure you're prepared for winter. The garden will need harvesting and preserving, the livestock will need preparations for cold weather, and—" She hesitated, "and you'll be alone again." The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. "I managed before," Thomas said, more gruffly than he intended. "Did you?" Beatrice asked gently. "Thomas, when I arrived, you were barely surviving. I don't say that as criticism, grief does that to a person. But I worry about leaving you to face another winter alone, especially with all these reminders of Elizabeth." Thomas stared into his tea, unable to meet her gaze. "What would you have me do? Sell the place, move back east?" "No," Beatrice said firmly. "This is your home. You and Elizabeth built it together and her spirit is here." She took a deep breath. "But perhaps you should consider hiring help or finding someone to share your life again." Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers in shock. "Beatrice, Elizabeth has been gone barely 6 months." "How can you suggest?" "Because I knew my sister," Beatrice interrupted, her voice steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "Elizabeth loved life too much to want anyone to stop living it on her account. She wouldn't want you to be alone forever, Thomas." The words struck him like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they rang with truth. Elizabeth had been vibrant, passionate about living fully. How many times had she chided him for excessive caution, for putting off joy in favor of practicality? "It's too soon," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Perhaps," Beatrice conceded, "but time passes differently here than in the city. Life and death are closer to the surface." Elizabeth understood that. She reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, Thomas. I'm simply asking you to consider your future." The touch of her fingers lingered on his skin long after she withdrew them. "I'll think on it," he promised, though he had no idea what such thinking might entail. That night, lying awake in the darkness, Thomas found himself confronting feelings he had been avoiding for weeks. Beatrice had come to mean more to him than merely his late wife's sister or a temporary helper. Her presence had brought life back to the homestead, and he had to admit to him. The thought of her leaving filled him with a dread that went beyond practical concerns about managing alone, yet the idea of developing deeper feelings for her seemed a betrayal of Elizabeth's memory. How could he care for her sister when Elizabeth had been gone such a short time? What kind of man would that make him? Sleep eluded him as he wrestled with these questions, and when dawn finally broke, he rose early and rode out to the farthest pasture, seeking solitude to clear his thoughts. It was there, sitting on a fallen log overlooking the valley, that Thomas finally allowed himself to imagine a future different from the one he had expected. What if Beatrice didn't return to Boston? What if she stayed not as his sister-in-law and helper, but as something more? The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. It would mean acknowledging that life continued, that love could bloom again even from the soil of grief. It would mean risking his heart when he had thought it permanently shattered by Elizabeth's death, and what of Beatrice herself? She had given no clear indication that she harbored feelings for him beyond friendship and family obligation. She had her own life in Boston, a respectable position, colleagues, students who depended on her. What could he offer to compete with that security? Thomas returned to the cabin late that afternoon, having made no decisions, but feeling somehow lighter for having acknowledged the questions. He found Beatrice on the porch, reading one of Elizabeth's books, her face peaceful in the golden light of the setting sun. "I was beginning to worry," she said, looking up with a smile that made his heart skip. "You were gone a long while." "Had some thinking to do," Thomas replied, settling into the chair beside her. "About what you said last night." Beatrice closed her book, giving him her full attention. And I don't know what the future holds," Thomas said honestly. "But I do know that these past weeks having you here have made this place feel like home again. I'm grateful for that, whatever comes next." Something softened in Beatrice's expression. "I'm glad," she said simply. That's all Elizabeth would have wanted. The mention of Elizabeth no longer created a wall between them, but rather a bridge of shared love for a woman who had shaped both their lives. They sat in companionable silence as the sun slipped behind the mountains, each contemplating possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. The following days brought a subtle shift in their interactions. There was a new awareness between them, a consciousness of each other that manifested in small ways, fingers brushing when passing dishes at dinner, gazes held a moment longer than necessary, conversations that stretched late into the evening as neither seemed willing to end the day. Thomas found himself noticing things about Beatrice he had overlooked before: the graceful curve of her neck when she bent over her sewing, the quiet determination with which she approached even the most challenging tasks, the dry wit that emerged when she was most relaxed. She was not Elizabeth, would never be Elizabeth, but she was extraordinary in her own right. For her part, Beatrice seemed to be wrestling with her own thoughts. Thomas occasionally caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something between confusion and yearning. She became alternately more open and more reserved, sometimes speaking freely of her feelings about the homestead and her time there, other times retreating into formal politeness that reminded him of her first days with them. The catalyst came in the form of a letter from Boston, delivered by a passing neighbor who had collected mail from town. Beatrice read it in silence at the breakfast table, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Bad news," Thomas ventured when she finally set it aside. "Not exactly," Beatrice replied, absently stirring her cooling coffee. "The school board is asking for confirmation of my return date. They're making arrangements for the fall term." Thomas nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. "I suppose they need to plan." "Yes." Beatrice's gaze was distant. "I should respond promptly. They've been very accommodating about my extended absence." "Of course," Thomas agreed, though each word felt like a stone in his throat. "When would you need to leave to arrive in time?" "The second week of August at the latest," Beatrice said, finally meeting his eyes. "Just over 2 weeks from now." 2 weeks. The time frame hung between them, suddenly making all their unspoken questions urgent. Thomas wanted to ask her to stay, to tell her how much she had come to mean to him, but the words stuck in his throat. What right did he have to disrupt her life? To ask her to abandon a respectable career for the uncertainties of frontier life with a widower still haunted by his wife's memory? "I'll arrange transportation to Denver," he said instead, rising from the table. "Excuse me, I need to check on the north pasture fence." He spent the day working harder than necessary, driving himself to exhaustion in an attempt to quiet his troubled thoughts. When he returned to the cabin that evening, sweaty and sore, he found Beatrice sitting at Elizabeth's writing desk, several sheets of paper covered in her neat handwriting spread before her. "I've made a list," she said without preamble as he entered, "of everything that will need attention after I leave. The garden harvest, winter preparations, preserves that should be made." She handed him the papers, her expression determinedly practical. "I've tried to be thorough." Thomas glanced at the pages' detailed instructions for tasks he should have known how to manage, but had surrendered to grief and neglect. The care evident in each precise note made his chest ache. "This is very thoughtful," he said inadequately. "I want to make sure you'll be all right," Beatrice replied, her voice carefully controlled. Elizabeth would expect nothing less. The mention of his late wife, which had become a comfort rather than a pain, now felt like a barrier between them. Elizabeth, her memory, her wishes, her legacy seemed to overshadow every interaction, making it impossible for either of them to speak plainly of their own feelings. "Beatrice," Thomas began, then faltered, unsure what he could possibly say that would bridge the gap between them. She waited, her blue eyes searching his face, but when he remained silent, something like resignation crossed her features. "I should finish packing my trunk," she said quietly. "There's so much to organize before I leave." Thomas nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. As she moved toward her room, he noticed for the first time how she had transformed it from the spare, utilitarian space it had been to something that reflected her presence, wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. Books stacked neatly on the small table, a quilt she had mended draped across the foot of the bed. Soon all traces of her would be gone, as if she had never been there at all. The thought was unbearable. "Don't go," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could consider them. Beatrice froze, her back to him, her hand on the door frame. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas took a deep breath, committing himself to a path he had barely allowed himself to contemplate. "I'm asking you to stay, Beatrice, not just for the harvest or for winter preparations, but permanently." She turned slowly, her expression guarded. "As what, Thomas? Your housekeeper, your sister-in-law?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Thomas crossed the room to stand before her, close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. "As my wife," he said simply, "if you could consider such a thing." Beatrice's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Thomas, we barely know each other, and Elizabeth, I loved Elizabeth," Thomas interrupted gently. "I will always love her, but she's gone, and in these past months you've helped me see that life continues. That I can continue." He reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull away, but she allowed him to take it. "I'm not asking you to replace her. No one could. I'm asking if you might consider building something new with me." Beatrice looked down at their joined hands, her expression troubled. "I came here out of duty to my sister, to help you through your grief I never expected." She trailed off, seeming unable to put her feelings into words. "Nor did I," Thomas admitted. "But here we are. I've come to care for you, Beatrice, deeply. And I hope you might feel something for me as well." She raised her eyes to his, and the vulnerability he saw there made his heart contract. "I do," she whispered, "and it terrifies me. It feels like a betrayal of Elizabeth, like I've somehow taken advantage of her death to—" "No," Thomas said firmly. "Elizabeth loved us both. She would understand how grief and healing can lead to unexpected places." He squeezed her hand gently. "Remember what you told me. That Elizabeth wouldn't want anyone to stop living on her account." A small, sad smile touched Beatrice's lips. "Using my own words against me, Mr. Crawford?" "Only because they were wise words, Miss Hammond." Beatrice withdrew her hand from his, but not in rejection. Rather, she seemed to need space to think, to process the momentous conversation they were having. "Even if we set aside concerns about Elizabeth," she said carefully, "there are practical considerations. My position in Boston, the difference in our lives and experiences, the challenges of frontier life." "All true," Thomas acknowledged. "I'm not asking for an answer this moment, only that you consider the possibility that you don't leave without us discussing what might be between us." Beatrice studied his face as if searching for doubt or deception. Finding neither, she nodded slowly. "I need time to think," she said. "This is unexpected." "Of course," Thomas agreed, stepping back to give her the physical space that matched the emotional space she needed. "Take all the time you need." Beatrice retreated to her room then, closing the door softly behind her. Thomas remained standing in the main room of the cabin, feeling both lighter for having spoken his feelings and anxious about what her answer might be. He had laid his heart bare. Now he could only wait and hope. The next day brought a return to their normal routines, though an undercurrent of tension ran beneath every interaction. Beatrice was quieter than usual, clearly deep in thought, while Thomas found himself alternately hopeful and despairing. Had he spoken too soon? Had he misread her feelings? Was he dishonoring Elizabeth's memory by pursuing happiness with her sister? By evening, the atmosphere in the cabin had grown so strained that Thomas suggested he sleep in the barn to give Beatrice more privacy. Her response surprised him. "No," she said firmly. "We need to talk about this, Thomas. Running away won't help either of us." They sat at the kitchen table, a pot of tea between them, like adversaries at a negotiation rather than two people contemplating a life together. Beatrice's hands were steady as she poured the tea, but Thomas noted the slight crease between her brows that appeared only when she was deeply concerned. "I've been thinking all day," she began, handing him a cup, "about your proposal, about Elizabeth, about what life might be like if I stayed." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I care for you," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength. "More than I expected to, more than is perhaps proper given the circumstances, but I can't help what I feel." Hope flared in Thomas's chest, but he tempered it, sensing there was more to come. "However," Beatrice said, meeting his gaze directly, "I won't be a replacement for Elizabeth. I won't live in her shadow or be compared to her at every turn. If I were to stay, if I were to consider becoming your wife, it would have to be for who I am, not for who she was." The firmness in her voice left no room for negotiation, and Thomas realized with sudden clarity that this was the heart of the matter. Beatrice feared being forever measured against her sister and found wanting. "I would never ask that of you," he said sincerely. "You're not Elizabeth. You're Beatrice with your own strengths, your own ways, your own heart. That's who I've come to care for." Some of the tension left her shoulders at his words. "And the homestead? Would you expect me to manage it exactly as she did?" Thomas shook his head. "The homestead would be ours to shape together. You've already made changes that work better than what we had before, the way you organized the root cellar, how you rearranged the kitchen." He smiled slightly. "Elizabeth would have approved, by the way. She always said her system was organized chaos." A ghost of a smile touched Beatrice's lips at that. She wrote as much in her letters, said you could never find anything when she was done organizing. The shared memory created a moment of connection, and Thomas seized it. "That's just it, Beatrice. Elizabeth will always be part of our lives and our memories, in the things she taught us both, in the foundation she helped build here. But our future, should we choose to share one, would be our own to create." Beatrice was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her tea. When she finally looked up, there was a new resolve in her eyes. "I need to visit her grave," she said. "Alone, before I can give you an answer." Thomas nodded, understanding instinctively. "Of course, take all the time you need." The next morning dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of golden light that made the mountain valley appear almost otherworldly. Thomas watched from the porch as Beatrice made her way up the gentle slope to Elizabeth's grave, a small bunch of wildflowers in her hand. She was wearing her blue dress, the one she had worn to the social, and had pinned her hair in the simpler style she had adopted during her time at the homestead. He tried not to speculate about what thoughts might be passing through her mind as she knelt beside her sister's grave. Was she asking forgiveness, seeking blessing, saying goodbye? Whatever communion she sought with Elizabeth's memory was private, sacred in a way he could not intrude upon. Thomas busied himself with chores, though his mind remained fixed on the woman on the hillside. After what seemed both an eternity and no time at all, he saw Beatrice rising, placing the wildflowers at the base of the wooden cross, and then standing motionless for several minutes, her face turned toward the valley below. When she finally returned to the cabin, her expression was serene, her eyes clear. Thomas set aside the harness he had been mending and stood to meet her, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. "I've made my decision," Beatrice said simply. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. "I will stay," she said. "I will marry you, Thomas, not because you were Elizabeth's husband or because I feel obligated to help you, but because I have found something here I never expected." She took a deep breath. "I've found a home. And I've found feelings for you that I do not wish to deny." Joy surged through Thomas, so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. When he could finally form words, they were inadequate to express the emotions flooding through him. "Beatrice, thank you. I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy." A smile broke across her face, then not the reserved, careful smile he had grown accustomed to, but something radiant and unguarded. "I believe you will," she said, "and I will do the same for you." Thomas closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly, suddenly shy despite the momentous decision they had just made. Beatrice's smile turned gentle. "Yes," she whispered, "I would like that very much." Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle meeting of lips that spoke more of promise than passion. Yet even in its restraint, Thomas felt something awaken in him that had been dormant since Elizabeth's death, a capacity for joy, for connection, for future happiness. As they drew apart, he saw in Beatrice's eyes a reflection of his own emotions, hope mingled with a touch of sadness for the path that had led them here. "I should write to the school," Beatrice said pragmatically, though her voice was softer than usual. "They'll need to find a replacement before the term begins." Thomas nodded, reluctantly releasing her hands. "And we should speak to Reverend Johnson about the wedding." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, "though perhaps we should wait a respectful period, for appearance's sake if nothing else." Thomas considered this. Part of him wanted to claim Beatrice as his wife immediately, to solidify their commitment before anything could change her mind. Yet he understood her concern for propriety, for the feelings of the community who had watched him mourn Elizabeth. Until autumn, then. He suggested, "After the harvest." Beatrice nodded, seemingly pleased with the compromise. "That would be appropriate. It gives us time to be certain, and it respects Elizabeth's memory." The mention of Elizabeth no longer brought pain, but rather a shared understanding of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. "She would approve, I think," Thomas said quietly, "of us finding happiness together." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, her eyes soft with memory. "When we were girls, she always said I was too serious, too focused on duty. She would tell me, B, someday you'll need to follow your heart instead of your head. I think this is what she meant." Thomas smiled at this glimpse of the sisters' relationship. "She called you B." "Only when she was teasing me," Beatrice admitted with a small laugh. "She knew I preferred my full name, and do you still prefer it? I mean," Beatrice considered the question with surprising seriousness. "I've always been Beatrice proper, precise Beatrice, but perhaps here in this new life." She smiled up at him. "Perhaps I could be B, at least sometimes." Thomas felt the significance of this small concession, a willingness to grow into a new version of herself, just as he was growing beyond the grief-stricken widower she had first encountered. "I think you can be whoever you choose to be here," he said. "That's the gift of the frontier, the chance to redefine yourself." The days that followed were filled with a new sense of purpose and, increasingly, joy. Beatrice wrote to the school board, explaining her decision to remain in Colorado and recommending a replacement from among her colleagues. Thomas rode into town to speak with Reverend Johnson, who agreed to perform the ceremony in late September, after the primary harvest was complete. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Thomas had braced himself for disapproval, for whispers about the impropriety of marrying his late wife's sister so soon after her death, but to his surprise, the response was largely positive. The women of Pinecrest, in particular, seemed to view the arrangement as both practical and touching, a way of honoring Elizabeth's memory while ensuring the future of the homestead she had loved. "Makes perfect sense," Mrs. Wilson declared when they announced their plans at Sunday services. "Who better to understand your loss than her own sister? And who better to continue Elizabeth's work here?" Beatrice handled these comments with grace, neither confirming the practical interpretation of their relationship nor revealing the deeper feelings that had developed between them. In private, however, she and Thomas continued to explore those feelings, learning each other's histories, preferences, and dreams in a way their circumstances had not previously allowed. Thomas discovered that beneath Beatrice's reserved exterior lay a woman of strong opinions and surprising passion. She could debate politics with the fervor of a seasoned campaigner, had firm ideas about how the homestead should be run, and revealed a mischievous streak that emerged most often when they were alone together. For her part, Beatrice uncovered layers to Thomas that Elizabeth's letters had never conveyed: his dry humor, his profound connection to the land, the depth of thought that his taciturn nature often concealed. She came to understand that the hard-working cowboy exterior hid a man who had read Thoreau and Emerson during the long winter evenings, who could recite Shakespeare when the mood struck him, who had dreams for the homestead that extended far beyond mere survival. As August turned to September, they worked side by side to bring in the harvest, their bodies developing a natural rhythm together as they gathered vegetables, preserved fruits, and prepared for the coming winter. The physical labor seemed to break down the last barriers between them, allowing a natural intimacy to develop that made their occasional kisses and embraces seem like extensions of their shared purpose, rather than separate expressions of affection. They decided, after some discussion, that Beatrice would continue to sleep in the spare room until after their wedding. This was partly for propriety's sake, though few would know or care in their remote location, but more importantly, it was to honor the significance of their marriage vows. Both felt that their unusual path to love deserved the dignity of traditional recognition. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn painting the aspen leaves gold against the evergreen backdrop. They had chosen to hold the ceremony at the homestead rather than in town, with only a small gathering of neighbors and friends in attendance. Reverend Johnson arrived early, bringing his wife, who helped Beatrice prepare in the cabin while Thomas and the male guests made final arrangements in the yard. Thomas had built an arbor for the occasion, positioning it so that the valley spread out behind it, showcasing the land they would share. Mrs. Miller and several other women had decorated it with late-blooming wildflowers and ribbons, creating a simple but beautiful setting for the ceremony. As the appointed hour approached, Thomas took his place beneath the arbor, dressed in his best shirt and the new vest Beatrice had helped him select on their last trip to town. He felt a curious mixture of nervousness and certainty, anxious about the public ceremony, but absolutely confident in the decision it represented. The small gathering grew quiet as the cabin door opened and Beatrice emerged, escorted by Jacob Miller, who had offered to give her away in the absence of any family. Thomas felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, not white, in deference to their unique circumstances, but beautiful nonetheless. Her honey blonde hair was arranged simply, adorned with small white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of late summer blooms gathered from the hillside. As she walked toward him, Thomas was struck by how right this felt, not a betrayal of Elizabeth's memory, but a continuation of the life and love that had begun here. Beatrice's gaze met his, steady and sure, and in that moment, any lingering doubts he might have harbored vanished completely. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They had chosen traditional vows, finding comfort in the time-honored words that had joined countless couples before them. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto Beatrice's finger, a ring he had ridden all the way to Denver to procure, he saw tears shimmering in her eyes, matching the emotion he felt swelling in his own chest. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Johnson declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering erupted in applause and cheers, as Thomas kissed his bride, no longer the tentative, gentle kisses they had shared during their engagement, but a firm promise of the life they would build together. The celebration that followed was simple but but joyous. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by neighbors' fried chicken, fresh bread, pies, and preserves. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon lively music filled the air as guests danced on the packed earth of the yard. Thomas and Beatrice moved among their friends, accepting congratulations and well wishes, their hands often finding each other as if drawn by magnetic force. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Thomas noticed Beatrice glancing occasionally toward the hillside where Elizabeth's grave lay, her expression not sad but contemplative. "Would you like to visit her?" he asked quietly when they had a moment alone. Beatrice considered the question, then shook her head. "Not today. Today is for us for our beginning," she squeezed his hand. "But tomorrow perhaps we could go together to tell her about the wedding, about our plans for the orchard." Thomas nodded, touched by her suggestion. "I'd like that." As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple, their guests gradually departed, leaving them alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood on the porch, waving as the last wagon disappeared down the trail, then turned to each other in the gathering dusk. "Well, Mrs. Crawford," Thomas said softly, "welcome home." Beatrice's smile held all the warmth and promise he could have hoped for. "I've been home for some time now," she replied, "but thank you for making it official." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the new gold band. "Shall we go inside? I believe there's a tradition about carrying brides across thresholds." Beatrice laughed, that full, unrestrained sound he had come to treasure. "I believe there is, Mr. Crawford. Though I warn you, I'm heavier than I look." "I think I can manage," Thomas replied with a grin, sweeping her into his arms in a smooth motion that spoke of his strength and the physical labor that had shaped him. Beatrice gasped in surprise, then wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes bright with happiness and a hint of the passion they had both been restraining during their engagement. As Thomas carried her across the threshold of the cabin, their home now, truly shared, he felt a sense of rightness settle deep in his soul. This was not the life he had envisioned when he and Elizabeth had first built this place, but it was a good life, a blessed one, and he intended to cherish every moment of it. The year that followed their wedding brought both joys and challenges to the Crawford homestead. The winter proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with snow piling so high by January that Thomas had to dig tunnels to the barn to tend the livestock. Yet inside the cabin, warmth prevailed not just from the well-stocked wood stove, but from the deepening bond between the newlyweds. Beatrice proved to be an ideal partner for frontier life, combining Elizabeth's practicality with her own meticulous nature. She kept detailed records of their stores, planned meals that made the most of their preserved harvest, and introduced new efficiencies to their daily routines. More importantly, she brought laughter back into the cabin, reading aloud in the evenings, teaching Thomas card games she had learned in Boston, even initiating snowball fights on the rare sunny winter days. Their physical relationship, initially tentative as they navigated the transition from friendship to marriage, blossomed into a deep and satisfying connection. Thomas discovered that Beatrice's reserve concealed a passionate nature that matched his own, while she found in him a tenderness and consideration that made her feel truly cherished. Spring arrived late but gloriously, with wildflowers carpeting the hillsides in a riot of color. As promised, they visited Elizabeth's grave together regularly, sometimes to share news of the homestead, other times simply to sit in companionable silence, acknowledging the complex path that had led them to each other. It was during one such visit in early May, on the anniversary of Beatrice's arrival at the homestead, that she shared news that would once again transform their lives. "I have something to tell you," she said as they sat on the bench Thomas had built near the grave. "Something important." Thomas turned to her, noting the mix of nervousness and joy in her expression. "What is it, Bea?" She took his hand, placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a child, in late November, according to my calculations." Thomas stared at her in wonder, his heart swelling with an emotion too profound for words. A child knew life emerging from the shadow of death that had brought them together, the perfect continuation of their unexpected love story. A baby, he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. Our baby, Beatrice nodded, tears of happiness shimmering in her eyes. I thought I hoped you would be pleased. Pleased doesn't begin to describe it, Thomas said, gathering her into his arms. I'm overjoyed, Bea, absolutely overjoyed. As they held each other in the warm spring sunshine, Thomas glanced at the simple wooden cross marking Elizabeth's grave. Though he couldn't explain it rationally, he felt certain in that moment that she approved, that somehow she had known this would be the outcome when she asked him to write to Beatrice in her final hours. Thank you, he whispered. The words meant for both women, the one who had been his first love and the one who had taught him to love again. The baby, a healthy girl they named Thomasina Elizabeth Crawford, arrived on a snowy night in late November, with Mrs. Miller serving as midwife. She had Elizabeth's golden hair and Beatrice's determined chin, and from her first breath, she was the center of her parents' world. As Thomas held his daughter for the first time, marveling at her tiny, perfect features, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. 2 years earlier, he had thought his life effectively over when Elizabeth drew her last breath. Now, holding new life in his arms, with Beatrice smiling tiredly up at him from their bed, he understood that endings sometimes contained the seeds of new beginnings. She's beautiful, he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled infant to Beatrice's arms, just like her mother. Both of her mothers, Beatrice corrected gently, a tacit acknowledgement of Elizabeth's continued presence in their lives. Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Both of her mothers, he agreed. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, illuminating the tableau of the new family, a cowboy who had lost and found love in the most unexpected way, the woman who had come to help and stayed to build a new life, and the child who represented their shared future. It was not the life any of them had imagined, but it was beautiful nonetheless, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the unexpected paths love can take, even in the wild and unforgiving frontier of the American West.